Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. But this is really important to think about, okay? Jill Cook said this in our podcast together, and I had a tough time not thinking about it for like 2 weeks after, okay? She said, you can't rupture a tendon if you don't have pathology. Pathologist meaning, something is damaged about the tendon or there's some sort of negative consequence over time for the non-geeky people, right? She said, to rupture a tendon, you must have pathology in it. She said it's a match between the pathology and how much load you put on the tendon. Healthy tendons won't rupture, right? She was saying that the tendon itself will not tear if it's really healthy. You'll probably tear the connection between the muscle and the tendon or some other thing about the bone before you tear a perfectly healthy tendon, all right? And then lastly, she said, but a gymnast can have a moderate amount of pathology, put massive load on it, and rupture. So one of the risk factors for gymnast rupturing is you need less pathology to rupture because the loads are so much higher. And the takeaway of this, of what she was saying and what I was trying to understand, is that she was saying that you can have a tendon that is very, very pathological. Someone who doesn't, I'm thinking about general population people. They don't really work out. They don't go to the gym. They don't take care of themselves. They're just very fragile, right? And so what happens is, she said, you can have people who step off a staircase and have a very abrupt landing and they rupture their tendon because the tendon is so pathological. Vice versa, you can have somebody with an extremely healthy tendon, say a young gymnast, right, who's maybe in the prime of their growth and they're doing really, really well. They're not taking high force skills just yet. They can have an extremely healthy tendon and they won't rupture, right? They might have pathology. They might have Sever's disease if the growth plate gets irritated, or they might have some Achilles tendon pain when they're younger because the tendon is starting to go through degeneration changes and maybe have symptoms, but they won't rupture. And so what she was trying to point out in the NCAA as a risk factor is that maybe there is a setup here where there's a moderate amount of pathology that is getting created, whether it's, I don't know, pre-college or in college, or what's going on with the season density or the lack of strength and conditioning being used from a young age with gymnastics, of gymnasts not lifting weights because of the cultural issues, the training loads not being monitored, right? Something probably is predisposing pathology inside their Achilles tendons that when they get to college, something happens and finally the tendon ruptures because the capacity is no longer able to keep up with the training load or the high impact forces of the spring floor. And like I said, I think there is a conversation to have about different spring floors and technique and a lot of other things. But I think the massive thing that a lot of people are not either recognizing or are willing to have a hard conversation about is what is going on before college, and then also the differences of college gymnastics in terms of season density and training loads compared to kids when they're younger. And I think until we are honest about that conversation, it's going to keep happening. I think we're going to keep seeing that the one double layout, quote unquote, I have air quotes for those listening, the one double layout that tore someone Achilles, the one double pike, like, oh, it was just that one double pike. I don't think so. I think tendons are very, very robust. And especially the Achilles tendon is one of the most robust tendons in the human body. So I think it's a more holistic conversation we need to have than just like, oh, it's this technique, it's the spring floor. There are many, many factors we have to consider if we hope to make a change. Year-round training is another thing commonly talked about with early specialization, which is training in your sport more than 9 months out of the year. And not a earth-shattering, thing we still have to deal with is that a lot of gymnasts take maybe 2 to 3 weeks off per year. If that, some gymnasts are scared to take more than a weekend off. They say that more than a week off is going to cause injuries. And the training load research we have now from Tim Gabbett and many others shows that, yes, prolonged time off, if you come back too fast, too soon, will probably elevate the risk of something going negatively. But really high quality research in periodization, strength and conditioning, many other sports shows us that training year round is maybe not ideal for young gymnasts because of the concerns it has on overuse and maybe the inability to recover and their body not be able to keep up. So it's funny because the COVID pandemic gave us a forced experiment in year-round training for gymnastics. And while I don't think that 3+, 4+ months is ideal for gymnastics, a lot of the gymnasts that I talk to who are college gymnasts and high-level NCAA gymnasts and then elite gymnasts said that the best they ever felt was after they came back from that like 2 to 3 month break. And I think we really need to apply that information on like, well, maybe gymnasts should take a relative off season, right? In college gymnastics we have a relative off season because of school and the way they train. But everybody else below the age of 18 is taking very, very minimal time off between nationals and their off season, or very, very minimal time off to cross train and do strength and conditioning and external weightlifting, because that's a culture issue as well. So this is like, just these two things alone are like massive things in the literature that a lot of people predispose somebody to have these devastating injuries later in their career. And as a culture and as a sport, I'm not saying we should just blindly apply the recommendations. Like, there's a recommendation for age equal training hours. Like, you don't train more than your age up until the age of 12. And I put that up on social media, and there was a huge, whiplash effect. I'm not saying we should blindly apply these things. I'm saying we should take these into consideration and have a conversation with a bunch of experts and make consensus statements about what could possibly be a realistic way to change and still get progress made in the sport and still make it amazing and awesome, because I want everyone to be involved in gymnastics and enjoy it. That's why I'm still involved. But when you look at the science and the data of what other sports are suggesting, and you compare it to what gymnastics is still doing, it's archaic, right? It's like crazy how we're so far behind some of the literature on early specialization, year-round training, gymnasts lifting weights, nutrition. So many things that I think we really have a lot of opportunities to work on here are still maybe not being used. And bringing it back full circle is like, well, maybe this is what's predisposing someone to have that moderate pathology when they're younger, and then they go to college and something out of the blue happens. Maybe it's a product of a lot of the issues pre-college that we have still some conversations to do.
Okay, like I said.
So let's talk about this. So this paper came out again a year ago when Ellen and I had just finished it. It was in May of, I think, 2021, which is when I gave this lecture. So it was in publication in Sports Health before I could talk about it, but now I can. So Ellen Casey, like I said, is the senior national team physician for Team USA. She's incredible. I'm very grateful to learn from her. She's a wonderful mentor of mine. And then Joey Bonanno was also on the Hospital for Special Surgery research team when this publication was put together. So it was myself and Jen Chang as well, who is the statistician at HSS. Shout out to her for all the help and the work. But we essentially, after seeing what happened in 2018, we're like, this is bad, man. This is bad. So what we tried to do is just use the best thing we could do available, which was a cross-sectional study from a survey point of view. So what we did is we made a survey of all sorts of questions, right? Your age, demographics, what school you went to, what was the hardest level you trained prior to NCAA, and what age did you start doing those skills at? What were the hardest skills you did? Back tumbling, front tumbling, vaulting, whatever else it is. We talked about being a specialist or an all-arounder, and we put this into a large survey. And then at the very end, it said, have you torn your Achilles before? And if you said yes, it toggled another kind of subset of questions about how did you tear it? When did you tear it? Background information about nutritional status. And Ellen's really, really a high-level researcher in women's health and menstrual disorders. So she talked a lot about, the questions with sub questions around disordered eating and stuff. We tried to break down a lot of risk factors to think about what was correlated with somebody who tore their Achilles. Okay. And what we found from that, right, when we look at the big picture, is we had a total of 581 gymnasts who reported on the survey. The mean age of those people reporting was 23. We tried to capture people who were in college or just recently out of college. We didn't really want to go up to like the age of 30 or years older, because the sport is very different now than it was 10 to 15 years ago with the equipment and skills being done. So we tried to keep things in a nice close cohort. 73% of the people who reported were from Division I schools. We had 100 Achilles tears reported in our survey, right? It doesn't mean 100 people tore their Achilles. That was 100 Achilles tears amongst these people. Some people had maybe one or two, but for the majority of them, it was 100 total. The average age of when they tore their Achilles was 19.9, plus or minus a year and a half. So that what that means is that it wasn't like freshmen were tearing their Achilles at the highest rate when they were 17 to 18 years old. We didn't see a difference across the years of university that they were actually reporting a tear. Okay. And when you look into the data and you dug down more, again, this is survey data, so keep that in mind. 91% of the tears occurred on floor. Okay. And 85.7% of those ones happening on floor were doing the back tumbling takeoff of a back handspring, right? So what that means is a large proportion of these tears are happening on back tumbling takeoffs. And I think a lot of people maybe understand that when they see, the issues going on. Like, not a lot of front tumbling, typically not a lot of sprinting based tears. It's really based on the takeoff portion of back tumbling. Okay, there were a few people who did tear their Achilles on vault. 9% of the tears came from vault, and it was 77% of those were during the springboard impact takeoff. a very few number of those were on the landing of vault, right? And then again, a very few number of those were on the front tumbling landing of floor. The majority of things were the takeoff of a back handspring or takeoff of a round off into a double back or a double pike. Okay. I think, again, almost all of them were back handspring. 78 of the tears were on back handspring takeoff. Right. So 70.9% of the people who tore their Achilles reported some sort of pain in the preceding 4 weeks. And that's a really important thing to take away and think about, right? Is that they had some Achilles tendon pain or stiffness or tightness. I'm not saying that if somebody has calf tightness, they shouldn't do gymnastics. I'm just reporting the data of what we found is that a large percentage, almost 3/4 of the people had some sort of Achilles tendon pain in the 4 weeks prior leading up to when they actually had a tear. Okay. And I want to say this as well. These are things that we did not see. Okay. This was not correlated to Achilles rupture and was not statistically significant between these two groups. Number one was body mass index. And I wanted to put this in because this is something that I'm going to pardon my French and say it's complete horseshit that people say all the time sometimes, which is like, oh, you gained 15 pounds, you tore your Achilles. Like the jump to conclusion from someone saying that like they went to college, gained weight and tore their Achilles with literally zero data to support that right now is monstrously devastating and can be possibly really, really negatively impactful on someone's mental and emotional health. So while I'll be the first to tell you that the survey data we had is not really high quality literature and high quality research, I don't want people to jump to the conclusion and automatically say that like because someone gains weight that they automatically tear their Achilles. And I think when you look at the demographic of types of Achilles tears happening across the NCAA, there's no pattern. There's no pattern of body type, of tumbling technique, of certain things that we know of yet related to that. And so I want to stomp that out real quick. If down the road, somebody does a study and that sends to come out, I'll be the first one to say it's something we have to consider. But right now, I think it's crazy that people are still reporting that or talking about that behind the scenes. So pardon my French. I don't mean to be sassy, but I'm just an honest guy. I can't be other than myself when I talk about podcasts and this kind of stuff. But that, I think, as of right now, we really don't have good evidence to support that at all. So please keep that in mind when you're talking to people or having conversations about it, okay? We also didn't see, interestingly, that floor or vault specialists were correlated with reporting on the survey they tore their Achilles. And for me, that was really interesting because going into the research study, that was one of the hypotheses that I actually put forward is that someone who specializes in floor and vault would be more training load on their Achilles, and that might cause them to be more elevated of a rupture. Okay. The age of specialization in gymnastics also was not correlated. Another thing that I thought maybe would be a history of youth ankle injuries. So having Sever's disease or Achilles tendinopathy was not something reported. And that goes against something that I've actually talked about as possible risk factors. And I've talked about on other podcasts. I thought that would also be something. And I think there's a little bit more to dig into in terms of how the survey was like recall bias is probably a thing. But as of now, I have to kind of eat my own words because I thought that was going to be something and it did not shake out in our literature. Okay. And then also the use of like oral steroids or medications for anti-inflammatories. That's something that's obviously correlated with tendon health degeneration in the research, but we did not find that. And then also current symptoms of the female athlete triad or Red S syndrome during college. And this is not something we asked about during youth, which looking back on our study, I wish we would have, because as Jill Cook's conversation went on, that was something that she said maybe is a risk factor when you're young. If you have not the greatest nutritional profile and you maybe have an underfueling situation that your tendon can't grow optimally and maybe develop all the collagen fibers it needs to be healthy. She told me that all of your collagen fibers in your tendons develop before the age of puberty. So that's really interesting to think about. But also, okay, and what are some suggestions that come from my brain on the overall arching picture of what can be done? So pre NCAA, and again, there's a lot of great research here to support these, is we really need science-based education for coaches, right? We need high-level, evidence-based, expert-influenced coaching education, right? To understand strength conditioning, nutrition, mental health, training loads, right? We need expert coaches to talk about training hours and what goes into those training hours and rotating of surfaces and drill and skill and technique development. We really need high-level education. The conversation of overhauling the educational system around gymnastics about needing a proper 1-year degree with mentorship and then another degree and maybe 2-year mentorship with high-level gymnastics is a conversation for another time, but we need to mirror the medical model and make sure coaches have high-quality education, okay? We need to have conversations about when we start suggesting or allowing young gymnasts to do really difficult vaults and really difficult passes like double backs, double pikes, because I think there's going to be an influence of those things being trained at a younger age and competing on a harder surface and how that affects tendon health and tendon quality. We need to really have guidelines and consensus statements around these different experts and people working at the club level going towards college about how we're going to manage that, and maybe putting some bumpers around when we allow athletes to start doing those really hard passes, and not just taking a really young, talented firecracker of an athlete who can do a double pike or can train a full out and doing it just because it's a cool thing to show off on TikTok and Instagram, right? Like, we have to really pace these athletes out and show that we have these skills in our back pocket to train for colleges or elite, but maybe not do them at 12, 13, 14 until they get up to the age of 15, 16 when they're fully mature and they have a lot more strength, right? We know from research like Istvan Bali from Canada that young athletes 12 to 14 and 15 are not at their peak level of strength, power, cardiovascular fitness. They might be able to learn a lot of skills and they're really, really good for flexibility, but they're probably not going to be optimal to take these things on super, super heavy. So we can use those as a way to train those skills and make really good progressions towards that. Like my buddy Nick Ruddick and people like Amy Borman have phenomenal ways to develop high-level athletes who have college or elite goals, but not put so much training load on them at a young age, it burns them out. Okay, we need to really adopt hybrid models of strength and conditioning for gymnastics that uses external weightlifting properly. Again, very large discussion here, but we need to make sure as a culture, we're not believing the myths and the misunderstandings of kids lifting weights that it's going to make them bulky or lose their flexibility or get them hurt. There's a substantial amount of evidence showing that it's very supportive, and we need to adopt this at a young age. All the athletes that I work with start training around 12 for weight training, and they do a hybrid model of gymnastics, body weight, and external weightlifting. And we change that based on in-season versus out-season. But that has to be something that we have an honest conversation about and start educating people on and implementing them on to find a great strength coach and understand how to use this properly. Okay. We also desperately need specific workload and wellness monitoring systems in gymnastics. And I've been really lucky to work with Tim Gabbett, and Ellen and I have a project going right now in the NCAA for this, but we need a better way to track training loads. And I'll talk about the different types of that and what that means. But if we don't understand the forces and we don't understand how athletes are responding to those forces, how in the world do we know how to help somebody get ready for a season, or how hard gymnastics training and competition season is? That's a huge problem that still exists. Okay. And then lastly, we have cultural issues around overtraining, nutrition and underfueling, and year-round training and early specialization. It's just blatantly obvious that I don't think we need to take the research and apply it with a cold, hard, black and white approach. But we have never done a different model than what we've done the last 20 years with talking about training hours and talking about year-round specialization and taking breaks after nationals and properly fueling for gymnastics and getting out of this like tiny stick mentality for young athletes because it looks aesthetically pleasing, right? Like, that's crazy. And it's absolutely bananas that we still have this conversation around disordered eating from comments people make, or unrealistic, ridiculous standards that people have. Back to my, small anger moment with BMI and stuff like that. We have to really have a conversation about how to get high quality education to coaches and gymnasts themselves about what to do. And there's phenomenal resources out there for all this stuff: strength conditioning, nutrition, mental health. We need a multidisciplinary approach to young gymnastics. And I know finances are an issue and finding the right people, but the blessing of the internet and many other financial abilities to do that, there's many people who are willing to help. Okay. So another thing I really want to come back to and highlight is I think that we really have to appreciate training loads difference in college versus club and NCAA, right? Gymnasts go through a dramatic change in the season length and the density of their season of club and elite compared to NCAA. And I think this opens up a bag of worms here with very complex discussions around workloads and planning and season structure. But again, going back to, we don't have a great system to monitor workload yet and to understand workload in gymnastics. And it's something I've been, the last 5 years has been the main kind of priority of my research projects with Ellen. But we're getting there, which is great, but we still don't have something that we can use to monitor these things. Okay. So Tim has a really awesome concept, and I'm lucky to be friends with Tim, and all the credit goes to Tim's work. I have all his references in the sections. I've learned so much from him, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but he has this awesome concept of the floor, the ceiling, and then this concept of time to track workload across a season, or to kind of look at this kind of stuff, to monitor for spikes. And I like this analogy because it's really good for us to take away and apply to college gymnastics. Okay. The floor will be their baseline level of capacity coming into preseason. So when they first get back on campus and they first start, getting ready to train, right? The floor is that bottom line that they have in terms of, strength, capacity, aerobic fitness, all that kind of stuff together makes up their training workload, right? The amount of training workload they're doing when they first walk in the door. The ceiling is what's referred to as the maximal amount of capacity they need to be successful at the hardest part of their season, right? So whether it's back-to-back weekends or college regionals or NCAAs, the ceiling is the highest capacity we need to be ready at to come perform. And I would always argue that's like, maybe the second or third week in the meet when you want to have all your routines hitting on full cylinder. First ones are getting the rust out a little bit. You do an inter squad, then you get back up to it. But the ceiling is kind of this idea of what's the maximal amount of training load we need to feel ready to dominate our meets, right? So that's the ceiling. The time is the interval between those two things. So how long do we need to get athletes ready from the baseline they walk in at the capacity level at the preseason to feeling really ready and good to go for competition season? That time interval is what we have to work on building training load and building their capacity up. Okay. A spike, right, is referred to as a rapid increase in workload in 1 week compared to the prior few weeks. And it's referred to in many circles as the acute to chronic workload ratio. I know it has a lot of controversy around the statistics and around some of the applications and injury prediction. I don't think that's what we want to use that for here, and I don't think it advocates for that. I think really what we're trying to say here is how do we manage and look at training load to get somebody ready and have their body conditioned, their Achilles conditioned for the season coming up. What we see here is that maybe one of the things to consider is that maybe it's too aggressive of a ramp up, that we don't have enough time in college gymnastics season to get athletes ready and develop their capacity at a timeline to make sure that we're conditioning their Achilles tendons enough. We're getting their knees and their ankles and their leg muscles ready. We don't have enough safe landing preparation, right? We don't have enough time to expose soft to medium to hard surfaces over the course of a 2-month period. Maybe that's part of the issue. Maybe part of the issue is that the ratio of preseason to in-season is not balanced enough, that we need more preseason time and a less dense competition season, or a less long competition season, to allow more time for their bodies to be conditioned. Maybe that's a part of it. I think this is particularly true if an athlete is in what Tim calls the basement, which is if you're injured, or if you have an off season when you needed a surgery, or say you got sick, or you had a COVID break, for example, and you couldn't train, your actually training load is much lower than the floor. It's in the basement, right? So you have a larger gap to go from the basement to the ceiling than you would from the floor to the ceiling if you had those 2 extra training weeks because of a COVID protocol, or you had 2 extra months because of an injury or a surgery you couldn't train through, or something like that. So if athletes come back in a lower level of baseline, it's so much more aggressive to get them higher. And this varies so much differently for different athletes, different individuals, people doing 2 events versus 4 events, which again comes back to why we need a way to measure training load specific to the gymnast and what they're working on, which is the system that I've helped build with Tim and we've tested in the last 5 years. I'll talk about later in the lecture. Okay, so here's some thoughts, and I hope this doesn't offend anybody. I'm just thinking out loud based off the research. Okay, number one is that you could possibly extend the season longer so that the season density is not so aggressive, right? That's not, you would add more time to build capacity, but this isn't a realistic option, right? We can't just keep kids on campus longer because they want to do a longer preseason because the risk of injury is higher. That's probably not realistic. Okay. Thought 2, though, is that what if we pull the floor back in terms of more time on the back end, or the front end, right? The longer season puts more time on the back end, so you have a longer pace to get to your ceiling, right? A floor being pulled back a little bit is going to be allowing someone to have more time to get more capacity in. So say they come in earlier, possibly, right? Maybe they come to school earlier. Not a realistic option for most programs, right? They can't just have athletes come back in the middle of the summer due to, obviously NCAA rules and logistics and red tape and coaching and access to facilities, but it's probably not a realistic option. However, what if we either start the season later, or we don't have as dense of a competitive season, right? That will add sand into the hourglass, and that will also control the rate at which sand is going through. So maybe it's in every other week. Maybe we do 2 back-to-back weekends, then we take 1 week off where we're maintaining training load, but we're not traveling somewhere, competing somewhere on a hard surface, right? I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud, right? But that's a possible option when you take all this information, the science from Achilles Tears, the science from Jill Cook's research, Tim Gabbett's work, periodization, all this stuff, you put it together with cultural issues in gymnastics. That's what shakes out as maybe an option to think about or have a discussion about. Okay. This would give you more time to build their capacity, and it would also reduce their capacity decline throughout, right? Because the sand will not drop through the hourglass as fast. Okay. Thought 3, which is my personal recommendation to put more eggs in the basket, is raise the floor, right, coming into preseason, right, or in their off season, and go to what Tim calls the penthouse, right? So if you have an elevated floor and you have more training capacity, your athletes are fitter, they've done strength conditioning in the off season, you can probably achieve a higher preseason level of capacity going into the season, and you can hopefully have more capacity of the Achilles tendons, their knees, their ankles, their legs, whatever, to hopefully reduce the risk of injury and perform better, which is what everybody wants, okay? If we raise the floor, we can do this with previous options of time extension, but this is where adding weight training and hybrid models of strength and conditioning is massively, massively valuable, because we can add more sand into their hourglass, but not build on high volume of impact and do tumbling, right? They're probably maximizing the training time bucket in the gym, right? They're going to the gym, doing skills, doing their physical preparation, doing all the stuff they need to do. They're probably already doing a lot of that. Where's the availability of getting more capacity in? Well, that comes from the blatantly obvious version of getting through some of the cultural myths of weight training and adding more sand into the glass earlier, which is exactly what we do at our facility, which is why we're such big advocates of it, because we see if somebody can come back after seasons, so say they take their 2 to 4 weeks off with finals and they get back, they rest. If they come back in late May or early April, which is when a lot of the athletes come and start working, late May or early June, and they get a full 3-month training cycle in 2 full 6-week programs or 3 4-week programs with our strength coaches doing gymnastics specific strength conditioning and the movements that we know are really helpful, not just copying a football program, right? We see monstrous increases in a lot of really positive metrics. And we test these at our facility. We have vault force plates and we have time gates that look at sprint time, jump performance, strength, like dynamometry for strength. We see really, really good increases. So I oftentimes will use those 2 to 4 weeks when they're home, or sorry, when they're off to be their rest. When they come home, they usually see me for an assessment. We look at any medical issues. We add in some rehab to their PT programs and strength programs. They work with me a little bit, but they work with our strength coaches, and we kind of add more to try to get them going in the right direction. But this requires great strength coaches who talk with coaches who know what to do. It requires athlete commitment. A lot of things have to go well here, but it's a huge opportunity for us to really make a positive impact. Okay. And those are the big things that I think we can focus on are the season density, the length, right? And then also the hybrid strength conditioning models, along with all the things I just mentioned in the pre-college NCAA, right? Like if we attack those factors, then also attack these factors in college gymnastics, maybe together, we can reduce the risk of Achilles tears happening during college so much. Okay.